Life has always been a roller coaster of heartbreak softened by unexpected blessings. I lost my parents at a young age, which was incredibly painful, but fortune smiled on me when my elderly neighbors, the Parkers, welcomed me into their home. They treated me not as a burden, but as their own grandchild, filling my life with affection rather than material wealth. As I reached adulthood, thinking of college and new beginnings, tragedy struck again. The Parkers died in a sudden car accident. Once more, I found myself alone. They left me a modest inheritance and their house in a leafy suburb. The house, though filled with fond memories, also echoed with solitude, prompting me to sell it and purchase a small apartment in the bustling city close to my college. I enrolled to study financial management, a field I found both challenging and captivating. After college, I secured a respectable job. My days were busy and fulfilling, yet evenings brought a loneliness that seemed out of place in such a crowded city. That changed the night I met Luke at a friend's gathering. He was vibrant, hilariously loud, and utterly unapologetic about it. We clicked instantly, especially after he accidentally spilled my drink and offered to replace it with a simple, "Hey, watch it," followed by a charming grin. Luke and I bonded over our shared interests and distastes, like classic films and our mutual dislike for sushi. Conversations with him flowed effortlessly. When the party ended, I realized I wasn't ready to let him go. A year later, he proposed in his straightforward manner. No theatrics, just him, me, and a clumsily presented ring while we were lounging at home. His proposal was so him, so us, and I joyfully accepted. Marrying Luke didn't alter our daily lives significantly. We were the same, only now officially a team. We made a cozy life in my small city apartment, which was still close to the hustle of the city, yet now had someone to share the tranquil moments with. Life felt richer and more complete, and for the first time in a long while, the nights were filled with warmth and laughter, not solitude. Settling into married life brought its own kind of comfort, but life always seems to have a way of keeping you on your toes. Aiden's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, lived in a charming suburban home and embraced me wholeheartedly from the start. Their warmth and kindness were soothing, especially as I continued to heal from the loss of my own family. "We're so happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Thomas would often tell me, her hands squeezed conveying a warmth that was both uplifting and a bit overwhelming at times. "Thank you. I can't tell you how much your welcome means to me," I'd respond, truly thankful for their openness and warmth. Visiting the Thomas became a cherished part of our weekends, filled with backyard barbecues and long conversations over hot coffee. Life felt simple, honest, and fulfilling until it suddenly wasn't. Aiden had to leave for a year-long business trip, a great break for his career but painfully ill-timed for us. Soon after he left, Mr. Thomas' health sharply declined. Mrs. Thomas, distressed and overwhelmed, called me for help. "Eleanor, I hate to ask, but I could really use your help here. George is really not doing well," she said, her voice thick with worry. Without hesitation, I packed a bag and moved in with them to help. Mr. Thomas, once the strong foundation of their home, now seemed fragile, his vitality fading amidst the medical equipment that filled their living room. I took over the household chores so Mrs. Thomas could concentrate on caring for him. In the evenings, I'd read his favorite classics by his bedside, his eyes often closing long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Eleanor," he would whisper on his better days, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. "It's my pleasure." "Really?" I'd reply, squeezing his hand, hoping to provide some comfort with a simple touch. One afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, Mrs. Thomas sat down across from me at the kitchen table, looking visibly worn. "Eleanor, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, her hands nervously intertwined. "George was the main earner, and with him like this..." Her voice trailed off, the burden of financial worry evident in her expression. I put down my knife and gave her my full attention. "We're strapped, honey. I hate to even ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough spot," she said, her eyes downcast, clearly embarrassed by the situation. I didn't hesitate. Of course, Mrs. Thomas. I'll get on it right away, I assured her, determined to alleviate their financial stress. I began the process to rent out my apartment immediately, hoping it would provide the necessary support during this challenging time. Life had thrown another curveball, but together, we were navigating it one day at a time. Each month, I faithfully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Thomas, along with some extra for groceries and other mounting bills. The commute back to my city job turned into a grueling ordeal, but the conviction that family must support each other kept me going, especially on the toughest days. "Eleanor, you're a godsend," Mrs. Thomas would often say with heartfelt gratitude as I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd reply, though some nights, lying in the guest room, the city's distant sirens a faint backdrop, I felt the heavy weight of responsibility on my shoulders. Aiden's phone calls were my only solace, his voice connecting me to a life that seemed increasingly distant. "How's it going, Kim? You holding up okay?" he would ask, his concern piercing through the crackling long-distance line. "We're managing. Don't worry about us," I would say, injecting a cheerfulness into my voice I didn't quite feel, unwilling to burden him further. Life at the Thomas took a sharp turn when Ellie, Mrs. Thomas's daughter from a previous marriage, arrived unexpectedly. Her presence was immediately chilling, like an icy draft slipping under the door. I didn't know Ellie well, aside from what Aiden had told me and her frosty interactions with Mr. Thomas during her brief tension-filled visits. Already stretched thin with my work commutes and caring for an increasingly frail Mr. Thomas, Ellie's arrival brought a new layer of stress. It was clear she intended to stay, settling in as though she owned the place. One evening, Mr. Thomas summoned me with a feeble gesture. His voice was a strained whisper, urgent and foreboding. "Eleanor, you need to watch out for Ellie. She's not a good person." I leaned in, the seriousness of his tone tightening a knot in my stomach. "I understand, Mr. Thomas. I'll be careful," I promised, though unsure exactly what I was guarding against. Ellie wasted no time taking control. One morning, I found her in the kitchen, her demeanor stormy as she made it clear she wasn't here to help. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play housemaid or chef for anyone," she declared, her tone cutting as she sipped her coffee and eyed me dismissively. "Taken aback," I responded calmly. "Okay, Ellie. I've been managing things so far and I can continue to do so." "Good, because I don't plan on lifting a finger." "This is Mom's house after all," she retorted, her gaze challenging me. From then on, Ellie made her presence felt, and not in a welcoming way. She would order takeout just for herself and her mother, leaving their empty boxes on the table for me to clean up. Her disdain was palpable and painful, but I endured it for Mr. Thomas's sake. One evening, in a rare moment of warmth, Mrs. Thomas invited me to join them for dinner. "Eleanor, why don't you sit and eat with us tonight?" she asked kindly. Before I could answer, Ellie interjected sharply. "Mom, Eleanor's been busy all day. She probably prefers eating later." Her words dripped with feigned concern, but the underlying message was clear: she wanted me out of the way. Despite the sting of her hostility, I focused on maintaining peace for Mr. Thomas's sake, silently shouldering the challenges of our complex new family dynamics. As the days passed, my sense of belonging at the Thomas residence dimmed. Ellie's entitlement seemed to permeate every room, her influence growing stronger in the quiet of the night as she whispered with her mother, undoubtedly planting seeds of doubt about me. Mrs. Thomas, once a source of warmth and understanding, began to change. Her once kind glances turned colder, her gratitude less frequent. Tragically, Mr. Thomas passed away, and the atmosphere at home grew even more strained. Aiden returned for the funeral, and his presence was a brief respite from the growing tension. However, even in mourning, I could sense the dynamics within the house shifting subtly, but surely. Ellie put on a facade of politeness during the funeral, but I knew it was just a temporary show. "How's everything been while I've been gone?" Aiden asked quietly during a rare moment alone after the service. "Fine. Everything's been fine," I lied, masking my stress with a forced smile. I didn't want to add to his sorrow. "You sure?" "You look a bit worn out," he observed, his concern evident. "It's just been busy helping out around here," I reassured him, avoiding further details. It wasn't the time to discuss the undercurrents of tension. As soon as Aiden left, Ellie's facade crumbled. The pretense of the caring sister vanished, replaced by a dismissive sneer I had become all too familiar with. Mrs. Thomas, lost in her grief, turned colder towards me, her commands replacing the gentle conversations we once shared. I felt more like an intruder than a family member. Ellie assumed control over the household as if she were the rightful heir, her reign characterized by a blatant disregard for anyone else's feelings. She would barge into my room unannounced, rummaging through my belongings as if searching for treasure. One afternoon, while seeking solace in the garden, I stumbled upon a box hidden among the shrubs. Opening it, my heart sank as I discovered my watches, jewelry, and even some personal items like underwear, all thrown away like trash. Nearby, several of my dresses were carelessly draped over a bush. Seething with anger, I confronted Ellie in the living room, where she lounged nonchalantly. "What the hell, Ellie?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. "You can't just throw my stuff out like this." Ellie laughed coldly, her harsh tone filling the room. "Please, you live here. You're just a guest and not a welcome one. You should be out in the garden, or better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a freeloader," she spat cruelly. Her words stung like salt in a wound. I was shaking as I turned to Mrs. Thomas, who had just entered the room. "Mrs. Thomas, please tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too," I pleaded, my voice cracking with emotion. But the Mrs. Thomas who once welcomed me with open arms now looked through me as if I were invisible. "This is Ellie's house now." "She's right," she stated coldly, siding with her daughter. The betrayal was as sharp as a knife, cutting through the last thread of hope I had for this place I once considered home. "Eleanor, perhaps it's time you found a new place to live." Mrs. Thomas's words hit me unexpectedly hard. Standing there, clutching a box of my belongings, my heart felt as if it might shatter. The home I had embraced as my own, the family I believed I had found, seemed to dissolve before my eyes. Despite this deep betrayal, I stayed, driven by a promise I made to Mr. Thomas on his deathbed to care for his wife and protect her from Ellie's overbearing influence. But as days passed, Mrs. Thomas seemed to increasingly reflect Ellie's harshness, her demeanor growing colder and her words more cutting. "You're just sitting on your hands here, aren't you?" Mrs. Thomas snapped one evening as I cleaned up after dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the sting of her accusation. "Best? Could have fooled me. Seems like you're just freeloading," she scoffed, turning away dismissively. Her words hurt. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my own apartment, transferring almost all of that income to Mrs. Thomas, on top of managing the majority of the housework, while Ellie did nothing but criticize. Ellie, who lived comfortably off her mother's pension, was relentless. "Really? What did my brother even see in you?" She would taunt me night after night, her words echoing through the thin walls. I would swallow my anger and frustration, reminding myself of the promise I made to Mr. Thomas, but the atmosphere became suffocating, the house a minefield of hostility. One evening, coming home early from work, my world shifted irreversibly. I overheard Ellie and Mrs. Thomas discussing in the living room, unaware of my arrival. "We need to get her to sell that apartment of hers. You know how much we could use that money," Ellie's aide, her tone greedy and calculating. "Yes, but how do we convince her?" "Eleanor's no fool. She won't just hand it over," Mrs. Thomas responded, her voice a mix of frustration and greed. "Leave it to me, Mom. I'll sweet-talk her into it. Once she signs it over, we can finally live the way we deserve," Ellie plotted confidently. Hearing them scheme to strip me of my only financial security was a chilling dose of reality. Fear and betrayal gripped me. I couldn't stay any longer. Heart pounding, I quietly retreated to my room. They were planning to rob me of everything. The decision crystallized in that moment. There was no reason to stay. I hurriedly packed my essentials, my hands shaking. Each second in that house felt like a ticking bomb. I didn't bother with goodbyes. They didn't deserve them. Slipping out the back door, I ordered a taxi to the train station. Sitting on the train to Aiden's state, doubts and fears swirled in my mind. Would Aiden understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but the fear of what might happen if I stayed was far worse. Staring out the window, the landscape blurring past, a mix of fear and resolve settled in my chest. When I arrived at Aiden's place, his reaction was a mix of shock, relief, and confusion. His eyes widened as he opened the door to find me standing there, bag in hand, looking as frazzled as I felt inside. As I stood on Aiden's doorstep, he looked perplexed. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" "Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I paused, the comforting familiarity of his temporary home washing over me. "No, Aiden, everything's not okay." "Not at all," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He led me to the couch, his face etched with concern. "Talk to me, babe. What happened?" Sitting beside him, I began recounting everything from Ellie's sudden return and her increasing dominance at home, to the covert financial manipulations, and the final straw, their scheme to force me to sell my apartment. I had kept all this from him initially. I didn't want to add to his stress while he was away on business. With each detail I shared, Aiden's expression grew darker. When I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw set in anger. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and concern. "I didn't want to cause more trouble. I thought I could handle it," I admitted, feeling foolish now. Aiden stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Eleanor, damn it, you shouldn't have to handle anything like that alone," he exclaimed. He was clearly upset by how his mother and Ellie had treated me. He stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on me, his eyes intense. "I'm not letting anyone treat my wife like that. No way," he declared firmly, pulling out his phone. I watched, heart pounding, as he dialed his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her words, but Aiden's tensed shoulders spoke volumes. "Mom, this has to stop. I know about everything and I won't tolerate it. If Ellie doesn't leave, and if you don't start treating Eleanor with respect, you can forget about us helping out anymore. No more money, no more nothing," Aiden stated firmly, leaving no room for argument. After a brief but fiery exchange, there was silence. Aiden's grip on the phone tightened. "Fine, if that's your choice, then you've made mine," he said finally, and hung up. He turned to me, his expression softening. "Looks like it's just us now, babe." "That's all we need," he said, coming over to embrace me. I leaned into him, the safety of his arms fortifying me against the whirlwind of emotions. "Just us," I murmured, feeling the truth of his words. We were on our own now, but somehow that felt okay. We talked long into the night, planning practical matters like arranging for me to work remotely and reevaluating our financial plans without the drain of supporting his mother and Ellie. It felt like we were laying the foundations for a new chapter, just the two of us. "Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right?" Aiden said with a determined grin. "Right," I smiled back, feeling more confident with him by my side. Over the next few days, we were a whirlwind of activity. I contacted my job to arrange for remote work, which they thankfully agreed to. Aiden helped me move my things from storage and set up a home office in a corner of his living room. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was peaceful. A week into our newfound peace, I was jolted by a call that felt like a ghost from a past life. It was Mrs. Thomas, her voice once sweet to me, now tinged with desperation and audacity. "Eleanor, why haven't I received the money for this month?" You know. The moment I answered the call, Mrs. Thomas's demand echoed sharply through the line. "We depend on it." I was momentarily stunned by her audacity. "I'm sorry, but after everything, you really expect me to continue supporting you?" I asked, incredulity painting my tone rather than anger. In the background, I could hear Ellie's voice, shrill and furious, urging her mother. "She's just an ungrateful girl, Mom." Make her transfer the money. Taking a deep breath to steady my rising anger, I remembered their venomous words. Mrs. Thomas, Ellie called me a ruthless beggar, remember? I'm not sending money to people who treat me like trash. I'm done. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost visualize Mrs. Thomas's shocked expression. But we're family, she finally said, her voice a blend of anger and pleading. No, family doesn't treat each other that way. Goodbye, Mrs. Thomas, I responded firmly and hung up before she could say more. The call left me shaken, but Aiden's presence was comforting. You did the right thing, Eleanor. It's time they learn to stand on their own, he reassured me, his arm around my shoulders. Not long after, as we settled back into our hometown, life surprised us again. I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled us with unexpected joy, and suddenly, the future brimmed with possibilities. We decided it was the right time to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, somewhere near a good school where our child could thrive. As we planned our move, another call came, again from Mrs. Thomas. Her tone was drastically different, desperate, almost pitiful. Eleanor, I've made a mistake. Ellie forced me to sell the house, took the money, and left me with nothing. Could I come in with you and Aiden? Her voice trembled, pleading. The request stunned me. After everything, this was a test of my resolve. Mrs. Thomas, you chose this path when you sided with Ellie against us. You could have chosen differently, I said, my voice steady despite the inner turmoil. I know I've made mistakes, but you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices? She implored. I sighed, a pang of pity mixing with memories of the pain her choices had caused. I forgave you long ago, but that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life. You need to live with the consequences of your actions, just as I have, I replied and ended the call. Then, with a resolute tap, I blocked her number. We moved forward with our plans, purchasing a quaint house with a little garden where our child could play. It was a fresh start, a new chapter just for us, filled with the promise of joy and the warmth of a family truly our own. It was one of those lazy Sunday mornings, the kind perfect for lingering over coffee and browsing through the newspaper. As I flipped through the pages, a headline abruptly captured my attention. Local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme. There, in the accompanying photo, was Ellie handcuffed and looking utterly defeated. A mix of shock and, admittedly, slight vindication swept over me. Look at this, Aiden, I called out, holding up the newspaper for him to see. It's Ellie. She's been arrested for fraud. Aiden came over and took the newspaper, his eyes scanning the article with a grave expression. I can't say I'm surprised, but still, it's a lot to take in. Yeah, it is. But she made her choices and now she's facing the consequences, I replied, feeling an unexpected sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Over time, news trickled in through friends about Mrs. Thomas's situation. She was living in a modest apartment, working 3 jobs to scrape by. Her pension wasn't enough to cover her living expenses and the debts Ellie had left her with. Did you hear about your mom? Aiden's friend, Jaden, mentioned one evening during a backyard barbecue. Yeah, I heard, Aiden responded as he flipped burgers on the grill. His voice carried a hint of sadness but was marked by a firm resolve. She chose her path, Jaden. It's tough, but that's how it is. Jaden nodded, understanding the delicate boundaries. You're right, man. Just thought you should know. The conversation shifted after that, the evening air becoming filled with lighter topics like sports and work. Life had moved on, and so had we. The true joy of our new chapter crystallized when Layla was born. Becoming parents changed everything: our priorities, our dreams, and it even healed some of the old wounds by replacing them with a new kind of love. Can you believe she's ours? I whispered to Aiden one night as we watched Layla sleeping peacefully in her crib. She's perfect, Eleanor. Just perfect, Aiden murmured back, his voice thick with emotion. We spent our days marveling at each little milestone Layla achieved, each smile, each giggle. She was our little miracle, and with her presence, the hardships of the past seemed to fade, making room for new, happier memories. Each day was simple, yet it was filled with small moments of joy that stitched together a tapestry of a contented family life.